This is David Farrell with another music theory video. In this video, we will talk all about the Neapolitan chord. It is a mysterious chord. It is a beautiful chord. After you watch this video, it won't be mysterious anymore. It'll just be a beautiful chord. In this video, we'll talk all about it, what it is, how it works, how we can use it in our composition. No stopping now. Let's go. Okay, let's get it out of the way. It's not an ice cream. Neapolitan refers to something from or someone from the city of Naples in Italy. And so that is where this word comes from. A Neapolitan person is somebody from Naples. If you have food in the Neapolitan style, it's from Naples. This chord has some historical connections to that place, but we find it all over the place now, and so the name has stuck for some reason. So what is it? What is the Neapolitan chord? Now that we've gotten the word out of the way, the Neapolitan chord is a chromatic chord. It occurs in both major and minor key music. What is this chord? Well, this is a very simple chord. This is not a whole family of chords like mode mix chords or secondary chords. This is one specific chord. It is a major triad built on the lowered second scale degree. Okay, major chord built on the lowered second scale degree. If we're in a major key, and here we can see A major, lovely A major, the Neapolitan would be built on B flat. It would be a B flat major triad. In the key of A major, the Neapolitan has two chromatic tones. B flat is a chromatic tone, and F is a chromatic tone. And of course, we see it's a B flat major triad, isn't it? B flat, D, and F. If we move to the relative minor of F sharp minor, we can find the Neapolitan there. Again, it's a major triad built on the lowered second scale degree, which in this case means it's built on G natural. Scale degree 2 is G sharp, and it's been lowered here to G natural. In minor, the Neapolitan only has one chromatic pitch. Here, that pitch is G natural. B natural and D natural both already belong to the minor scale. Because there's only one chromatic tone in minor, a Neapolitan is a little bit less jarring and surprising in that key. We tend to see Neapolitans more frequently in minor than we do in major, but they can pop up in major music too. They do the same thing, they're just a little bit more chromatic, so to speak, in a major key. When we're labeling the Neapolitan chord, we will use the capital letter N for our Roman numeral. Notice I have written a capital N underneath my chord. This indicates that we are talking about a Neapolitan triad. So this is what the Neapolitan is. If you want to write a Neapolitan, you want to find scale degree 2 of your scale, whether it's major or minor. You want to lower it by a half step, and then you want to write a major triad built on that pitch. That's all. So that tells us what it is. What about how do we use it? What does it do? Some things about how we use the Neapolitan. First, the Neapolitan chord is almost always found in an inversion, and it is almost always found in first inversion. So much so that you'll often people refer to the chord as the Neapolitan 6. Remember that number 6, of course, is what we use to indicate a first inversion triad. Lots of times you'll hear people talk about Neapolitan 6. It's talking about this chord, and the 6 just tells us that it's in first inversion almost all the time. The Neapolitan chord in terms of function has a predominant function. It typically resolves to 5. The Neapolitan has a similar function as a 2 chord, as a 4 chord, as a 5 of 5 chord. Any of these chords that like to go to 5, the Neapolitan is just another one. It's just another chord that likes to go to 5. When we're approaching the Neapolitan, we can often think about it as if we were approaching a 2 chord. The Neapolitan is an altered version of that 2 chord, so this should make some sense. Chords that might go to the Neapolitan include our tonic triad, our 6 chord, our 4 chord, or our 2 chord. Any of these chords can resolve to the Neapolitan with some ease, and we might see them pretty readily. And notice I've written the minor numerals here, but if we were in a major key, it would work the same way. Any of these chords could go to the Neapolitan. So our big picture here is that the Neapolitan shows up in first inversion, and it's a predominant chord. It resolves to 5. If we're thinking about approaching it, well, it sort of slots in similarly to where our 2 chord or our other predominant chords slot in. Shouldn't be too surprising. Let's listen to two chord progressions, one in the minor key and one in the major key that use the Neapolitan. It's got a surprising sound, it's got a dark sound to it, it's got a cool sound to it. Let's hear it. Lovely sounds. When we're composing with the Neapolitan, we've got some things to pay attention to with our voice leading. The Neapolitan has a pretty prescribed way of working in four-part writing, and we're going to stick to it pretty much by the book. If we stick to by the book, we're not going to encounter any difficulties. The Neapolitan will resolve in a very similar fashion almost every time. And so this isn't a place where we want to get too creative with our voice leading. It's a creative chord already, and so we'll resolve it in a pretty conservative way. The first thing, the bass, which plays the third of this chord in first inversion, is by far the most common doubling. When you part right with the Neapolitan, double the bass. The bass will be on scale degree 4. The bass, again, is the third of this chord. The bass will always be a diatonic pitch. Double the bass when you part right with the Neapolitan. The upper voices most typically will resolve either in contrary motion with the bass, so the bass resolving up to 5, your upper voices will resolve down, or oblique motion. They might resolve by common tone. Okay? A couple of things to watch out for. First, when you double the bass, do avoid parallel octaves with that doubled bass note. If we look at our first example in F sharp minor, you can see I've done a good job of spelling my Neapolitan. I remembered my G natural, my B natural, and my D, and I doubled the B natural. But when I went to 5, I did move in parallel octaves, and that's something that I want to avoid. Okay? When we're resolving to 5/7, this is nice because our doubled bass note can stay as a common tone. If we look at my second example, I didn't have that problem. My soprano did not have to resolve up by step in parallel octaves. Instead, it stayed on a common tone and became the 7th of my 5/7 chord. Very, very friendly voice leading when we resolve to 5/7 as opposed to the 5 triad. When we talk about some of the other notes, the lowered second scale degree, which is our most colorful note in this chord and which is the root of the chord, should move down. Its destination is typically the leading tone. Here, lowered 2 is my G natural, and notice that in both of my cases, it's resolved down to that E sharp. It resolves down via a diminished third, an odd interval, but one that we want to write in this resolution. Our lowered second scale degree, the root of the chord, should resolve down. Like most predominant chords, we can resolve to a cadential 6/4, delaying the arrival of our dominant triad. This is no different than resolving to 5. The cadential 6/4, just an ornamentation on the 5. And so we can use this with the Neapolitan. The voice leading doesn't really change. It's mostly contrary motion, moving downward, and the voice leading is generally very, very smooth, lots of steps here. One thing to watch out for, however, is depending on the voicing of your Neapolitan triad, you may have unavoidable parallel fifths in your upper voices. Taking a look at my first try at this, notice that my G major triad, my Neapolitan in F sharp, has a G natural in the tenor and a D in the alto, a perfect fifth. And to resolve that G down, as we must resolve that lowered second scale degree down, I end up with parallel fifths here, which isn't terribly lovely. The best way around this is to find an alternate voicing for my Neapolitan, and by inverting the interval of the fifth, I can now have parallel fourths instead of parallel fifths. If we look at the next example where I fix this, notice that I've switched the pitches on my alto and tenor part, and now instead of a perfect fifth from G up to D, I have a perfect fourth from D up to G, and I can resolve both down by step to another perfect fourth if this becomes a nicer voice leading. So when using the Neapolitan sixth with a cadential 6/4, do be aware of this issue and try to avoid it when you can. Another version of Neapolitan to 5 might involve moving through a chromatic chord, in this case, moving through a secondary leading tone chord to 5. And we can do this as well. This isn't a terribly complicated resolution. Again, the voice leading is very smooth. We see half steps in our bass, B up to B sharp, up to C sharp. We see half steps in our tenor voice, G natural down to F sharp, down to E sharp, and stepwise motion in our upper voices as well. B in the soprano, moving down to the 7th of the 7 fully diminished 7, the A, down to G sharp, and D getting chromatically altered to D sharp before resolving down to the root of our 5-7 chord. This sort of elaboration is a very fancy sound, lots of chromatic predominance, but it's something that we can do if we want to have a lot of tension before we arrive at the dominant. Those are all some relatively standard ways we can use the Neapolitan. The Neapolitan resolving directly to 5, whether the 5 triad or ornamented by a cadential 6/4. The Neapolitan passing through a chromatic chord, another secondary chord, another predominant chord on its way to 5. Here we have a couple of more exotic, more unusual ways to use the Neapolitan. I'll talk about them very quickly. They're not the most common things, but again, we should be ready because they do show up in some crazy music out there. First is the Neapolitan in root position. The Neapolitan in root position is unusual. Earlier in this I said the Neapolitan is almost always in first inversion, and it really is. But some people get crazy ideas and they put the Neapolitan in root position. It still functions as a predominant chord. This does not change the function of this chord. And it often resolves to root position 5 with a dissonant tritone leap in the bass. Here we see our root position Neapolitan, that G major triad, leaping up by tritone in our bass. This is a spicy one, and so be careful if you want to use it. Note that in this rather unusual bass position, I've changed my doubling a bit. I've doubled the root rather than the third here. The third doubling works best for our first inversion chord, but in this crazy world, we've got to do some other things. Another unusual variation that we can see from time to time is tonicization of the Neapolitan. We can tonicize the Neapolitan. We can write 5/7 of N, which I've got here. This is built off the lowered 6th scale degree and can be a nice, somewhat surprising chord in something like a circle of fifths progression. And that's the progression I've written here, a 1, 4, 7, 3. And rather than use the 6th chord in its regular diatonic way, I wrote a dominant chord on D, a 5/7 from the key of the Neapolitan, from the key of G major, borrowing from G major in my key of F sharp minor. Very, very spicy. Let's take a listen. Smooth voice leading and a sequence help cover up the spiciness of that progression, and so it actually ends up sounding pretty nice. And so we've reached the end of our video. In this video, we talked about the Neapolitan chord. We defined it as a major triad built on the lowered 2nd scale degree. We talked about its typical usage. First inversion as a predominant, a chord that resolves to 5. And we covered some of the basics of part writing and voice leading with the Neapolitan, which I can sum up with contrary motion. Okay? Those are the basics of this, but of course we went into much more detail. We'll be using Neapolitans in our music. We'll be looking for them. It's a chord that we see a lot in late classical and in romantic music. It's got a really individual, unique, cool sound, and so we'll keep our ears open and our eyes open for it. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, see you guys later.